Okay, welcome everybody. Thank you so much for coming along to the fourth of our History Open Talks. It's lovely to see so many of you here, and as you know, we're also joined online by a number of listeners and watchers. Those of you who are joining us online, you will be able to ask questions at the end. The email address you need to use is FASS, F-A-S-S, history-lectures at open.ac.uk. So please do send us in your questions. If you'd rather we didn't read out your name, we would only use your first name anyway, then please say so in your message. And my colleague Sinead, who's sitting down there with the laptop, will be able to read out your questions to us. And obviously you in the audience, I do hope you will participate in the discussion after our talk. So it's a great pleasure to me to introduce my colleague, Dr. John Slide, who will be giving our lecture today. John did his PhD at Cambridge University and then taught there for a while, as well as at Goldsmiths and Essex, before joining us at the Open University. His research interests are in the First World War in the Middle East and the British Empire in the Middle East and Arabia. As I'm sure most of you are aware, this is a really crucial and often overlooked area of study, actually, and many of the problems that we see in that region today have their origin in the First World War and its aftermath. So it's a particularly opportune moment, I think, for us to look at this topic. Among his publications is his really fascinating book, which I've brought along for you to see here, called The British Empire and the Hajj, which won the Trevor Rees Memorial Prize for, and I quote, being a most wide-ranging, innovative and scholarly work on imperial history. So I think we're in really very safe hands with John, and I will hand over to him now, and he'll speak for about 25 to 30 minutes, and then there'll be about half an hour if we want for questions and discussion. So thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you, Annika, and thank you all for coming. In terms of the advert for this talk, I think the strapline was looking at kind of Britain and Islam in the 19th century. In fact, I'm going to be looking mostly at the 20th century, but hopefully that won't put anybody off. Okay, so from the mid-19th century, a variety of men in various parts of the British bureaucracy, they saw that the world was being partitioned among the imperial powers, and they turned their gaze to what was becoming thought of as the Mohammedan world, the Muslim world. And these men were fueled by the development of the idea of Britain as what they called the greatest Mohammedan power, and this was largely based on facts of geography and demography. If we see in the graph there, we've got Britain as the main power governing Islam, as this chart from the time says. And these men sketched out a variety of visions for states under various forms of British control in which Islam would play a central role. And so my talk is going to trace the genealogy of some of these states. Now, in this period, the two world wars were really quite crucial, along with more general unrest in terms of advancing the development of these states or regressing them, and that will come up repeatedly. Now, while we can't draw a neat line from the examples that I'm going to talk about to the present day, I think there are a few common threads worth highlighting. The first is the position of these British officials. They were at the peak of the British state. They saw Britain as the key power in the world. They saw Britain as having the power to kind of make and shape states such as this. The other thing is the perceived importance that these men attached to Islam in fashioning the nature, viability, legitimacy, and success of these states in their minds. Islam was a card in some cases, a trump card to be played in this game of state-making. And this rested on a variety of incorrect assumptions about Islam and Muslims, and those sort of mistakes and misassumptions are grounded in a huge variety of misconceptions, which I don't really have time to go into here. But it was these misconceptions that sometimes caused these states to fail, sometimes spectacularly. A second thread connected with the present is the role of Muslim actors in these schemes. These states weren't dreamt up in a vacuum. These states had Muslim candidates as potential collaborators and puppets as rulers. And now these local men on the ground had varying degrees of religious legitimacy. Some of them were leaders of Sufi orders. Some of them traced their lineage back to Prophet Muhammad. And others had more sort of temporal roles as well. And these men were seen as vital in giving legitimacy, religious legitimacy to these states. And a final common thread to today is the role of conflict in these state-making, state-building exercises. Whether it was the world wars or more localized conflicts, they were critical factors that provided windows of opportunity to reimagine politics and the shape of states. And the role that the mobilization of religion played in war was critical. During times of war, it was thought that Islam could be mobilized, it could be weaponized to serve the aims of various warring powers. One notable example we have in the First World War was the Ottoman proclamation of jihad in 1914 and the moves by various powers to respond to that. So war was a catalyst for change, a catalyst for thinking about alternatives to the status quo. So to begin with my first example, and that's an Arab caliphate. And we begin with a man called Wilfred Blunt, who was a critic of British imperialism, an advocate of Egyptian independence, and he was a self-proclaimed expert on Islam. He wrote a book called The Future of Islam in 1882. Now, Blunt was convinced that the caliphate, which at that time resided in the Ottoman Empire, the Ottoman Sultan was also the caliph. Blunt was convinced that the caliphate would return to Mecca, the holiest city in Islam, and it should be held by an Arab, namely the Sharif of Mecca, who was the hereditary temporal ruler of Islam's holiest city. And Blunt believed that Britain would have the opportunity and the duty to act as the Arab caliph's advisor and ruler. And now Blunt's book didn't sell in huge numbers of copies, but it was very influential as time went on, especially amongst British officials and military officers. And when we get to the point of the First World War breaking out in 1914, and especially the Ottoman proclamation of jihad against the Allied powers in November 1914, the issue of who would be caliph and where the caliphate would reside became a very live issue. So the British Oriental Secretary in Cairo, which then was under British control at the time, a man called Ronald Storrs, was wondering how Britain might stoke disaffection against the Ottomans. And Storrs came back to Blunt's idea that the caliph should first come from the tribe of Prophet Muhammad, that's Quraysh, and this was a criteria that the Ottoman caliph did not meet. Sharif Hussein of Mecca, the ruler of Mecca, he met this criteria. And so Storrs was pushing for this Arab caliphate. Other British officials were much more wary that this interference in who the caliph was would have a backlash amongst their colonial subjects. And Storrs wanted the British to publicly promise that the caliphate would go to an Arab and move to Mecca. We have another man in Cairo at the time, a man called T.E. Lawrence, who became famous much later as Lawrence of Arabia. Then he was a lowly intelligence officer. He wrote that the Arabs could be kind of handled in this state. If the caliphate went to the Arabs, it would be an ideal vessel for the British to control. Now, this wasn't a top secret thing. There was a public proclamation in a propaganda leaflet dropped across Arabia, Palestine and Syria, which said that one of the British government's fundamental traditions is to be a friend of Islam and Muslims, and that there is no nation among the Muslims who is now capable of upholding the Islamic caliphate except the Arab nation, and no country is more fitted for its seat than Arab countries. And this becomes official policy. So we have Lord Kitchener, famous from the British Army recruiting poster. He's the Secretary of State for War in this period. He writes to Sharif Hussein himself, and he says, "Till now we have defended and befriended Islam in the person of the Turks. Henceforward it shall be in that of the noble Arab. It may be that an Arab of the true race will assume the caliphate at Mecca, and so good may come by the help of God out of all the evil which is now occurring." And Hussein's response to this was wary, and I'll come back to that later. But Kitchener was convinced if the caliphate was moved to Mecca, it would remain under British influence. And this sort of idea of returning the caliphate to Mecca was rooted in this broader notion amongst British officials about trying to return to what was seen as the original purity of Islam in its first centuries. And this is quite an important strand of British thinking which comes up later. Now, again, the British are looking to make capital out of this, and in Sudan, again, another British territory at this point, the governor, Reginald Wingate, says in a private letter, "If we can arrange this, political change will be a violent one. We'll have abolished the threat of Islam by dividing it against itself in its very heart." And he had this idea that the caliphate would become something like the papacy in Rome, in the Vatican. Now, the key thing here is that Kitchener and these other officials, they remain convinced that the office of the caliphate had this sort of magical property that would bring the Arabs together against the Ottomans, their wartime enemies. But this kind of slowly gets diluted over time as they kind of get into the complexities of trying to bring the Arabs in Arabia onto the side of the British against the Ottomans. Now, what was Sharif Hussein of Mecca, the gentleman with the beard in the middle, what was his reaction to all this? Sharif Hussein was very aware of how popular the Ottoman caliph was amongst Muslims across the world, and that's because the annual pilgrimage to Mecca, the Hajj, every year he came into contact with lots of Muslims, elite Muslims from across Africa and Asia. He knew how popular the Ottoman caliph was. Now, what Hussein wanted, he didn't really want to be caliph, he just wanted to be independent of the Ottomans and have a state of his own, and a state that would comprise the western shore of Arabia going up into Palestine and Syria. And what happened was the British want Sharif Hussein to revolt, but they realised that this issue of the caliphate is sort of too much of a controversial issue to engage with and give to Hussein. And so they dropped that and focus on getting Sharif Hussein to join the war on the British side, which he does in 1916. But this idea that Hussein might be caliph does resurface after the war. After the war, Sharif Hussein gets into a conflict with Ibn Saud, who is based on the other side of the Arabian Peninsula, and these are both British allies. And when Hussein is under attack from the Saudi forces in March 1924, he, in fact, proclaims himself as caliph. He thinks this is his kind of a way to defend the remains of his territory against the Saudis. But the reaction was universally negative because most Muslims saw Hussein as having lost his legitimacy by rebelling against the Ottoman Sultan Caliph and joining the British side. And so eventually Hussein flees Mecca, the Saudis take over, and basically his reign as caliph is a very short-lived one. And in fact, after this, the office goes into abeyance. Now, it turns out that an Arab caliphate was not advantageous or even necessary in helping Britain achieve its war aims in the Middle East. And so British officialdom's ideas and initial policy that the future of the caliphate lay in Arabia, in the person of the Sharif of Mecca, was very wrong indeed. And in the end, the Hijazi Caliphate was brought into being by Hussein itself, and his lifespan was short. But of course, we have the Caliphate coming back in the present, which I'll come to later. Now, I'll move on in the interest of time to the case of Libya. Now, in the 19th century, one of the key players in Libya is a group called the Senussi, and they're a Sufi order who are active from the 1830s. And they become this kind of Islamic bogeyman to the imperial powers who are operating in North Africa at the time, the French, the British and the Italians who invade Libya in 1911. The Europeans think that the Senussi, they rule this kind of secret kingdom in the desert, plotting conspiracies against the Europeans, but the truth of this was, well, they basically weren't. It was very wrong misconception. Now, the Senussi, they clash with the Italians when they invade Libya, and in fact, the order launches a jihad supported by the Ottomans against British-ruled Egypt in 1915, which is swiftly defeated. After this defeat, the leader of the order, Ahmad Senussi, he is deposed and replaced by his cousin, a man called Idris. And he is a staunch British ally, and he becomes based in the Fezzan, which is in the south eastern corner of Libya. And this is when the Senussi, it starts to form what we would call a state. They're attacked by Mussolini in the 1930s, and Idris is exiled, but then he returns with British help during the invasion of North Africa by the British during World War II. Now, once the British have ejected the Italians and the Germans from Libya, Idris is kind of seen as a key political player. And the British military administration, they seek to create the new state of Libya free from Italian and German control. And for that, they light on Idris as the Sufi king of the Sufi kingdom of Libya. And so the British really play a key role in this, and Idris plays an important role in the formation of Libya as a modern state. And it's the longest lived of what we might call Britain's Islamic states until Idris is deposed by Colonel Gaddafi in 1969. Now, if we move to another case which actually is not very well known at all, but I think it's quite fascinating, so I wanted to include it. This is in Southeast Asia. And this is a man called Abdul Rahman McBryan, and he was the private secretary to the Raja of Sarawak, a man called Viner Brooke. The Brookes were a family which conquered Sarawak in Southeast Asia in the 19th century, and they founded this dynasty which were popularly known as the White Rajas. And so McBryan is a very controversial figure in Sarawak at the time. People saw him as very intelligent, but almost unbalanced. He was always engaging in various schemes, and he was eventually fired from the civil service in 1930. He converted to Islam in 1935, and in fact travelled to Arabia and performed the Hajj in 1936. Now, McBryan had been interested in Islam for many years, but what we know is that, in fact, his conversion to Islam was what he saw as the first step in building political support for his own Islamic state in Sarawak. And he wanted to succeed the Raja as the White Caliph of Sarawak. Sarawak is there on the northern part of Borneo, one of the largest of the islands in the Indonesian archipelago. And so McBryan's plan was to use becoming the White Caliph of Sarawak as the launching pad for the conquest of the Dutch East Indies, the Green Territories there, and eventually Singapore and British Malaya. He wanted to rule over his own caliphate in Southeast Asia. And I think this is probably one of the more fantastical geopolitical schemes of the 20th century. Now, during the outbreak of World War II, the Japanese invade the European territories in Southeast Asia, and McBryan, along with the Brookes, the ruling dynasty in Sarawak, they find themselves in Australia. Now, in 1943, McBryan attempts to make his way back to Sarawak. This is a secret trip which is uncovered by the Australian authorities. The Australian authorities were concerned that McBryan was going to put his plan to become the White Caliph into practice, and the intelligence report says he might have designs on being appointed by the Japanese as a Quisling Muslim Raja of Sarawak. Quisling is a reference to the Norwegian leader during the Second World War who was a Nazi puppet. Now, what happens quite incredibly is McBryan, after the war, he's actually brought back into the service of the Raja, the Brookes, and he helps transfer Sarawak to become a formal British colony in 1946. After that, his trail goes a bit cold, but then he turns up again in Epsom, in Surrey of all places. He's committed to a mental hospital after he claims he could make himself invisible, and he steals some fruit from a market stall. And then eventually he dies in Hong Kong in 1951 in mysterious circumstances after being arrested for unauthorised directing of traffic. Now, this story is obviously quite colourful, and we might just sort of dismiss this as one of those fascinating but ultimately insignificant episodes of history. But the reason for telling you this story, aside from the fact it's an interesting story in and of itself, is to show how the war opens up political opportunities for people like McBryan. Now, it's unlikely that Japan would have offered him the role of Raja or White Caliph or whatever we want to call him, but stranger things have indeed happened. And again, the role of Islam is important here. Without his status as a Muslim, McBryan knew he had no chance of succeeding the Brookes, as he had little legitimacy as they in ruling over the indigenous population. But being a Muslim, McBryan thought this gave him more justification and legitimacy to rule over Sarawak's Muslim population than the Brookes themselves. Now, if we move on to the realm of the present. So now I'm going to talk about Afghanistan and Iraq and try and sort of link these sort of two stories together. And first of all, we've got the role of American support for the Afghans in the 1980s against the Soviet invasion and occupation. And shortly after the Soviet invasion, we get the US National Security Advisor, Brzezinski. He flies to Pakistan and he sets about to rally the Afghan resistance. He wanted to arm the Mujahideen without revealing America's role in this. And on the Afghan border, near the Khyber Pass, he urged the Mujahideen to redouble their efforts. And his quote here again is significant. "We know of their deep belief in God. We're confident that their struggle will succeed. You will go back to your land one day because your fight will prevail. You'll have your homes and your mosques back again because your cause is right and God is on your side." Now, the Americans wanted a non-Soviet allied, a non-communist regime in Afghanistan, and for them, that meant a pivot towards the Mujahideen and Afghanistan as an Islamic state. Now, we have, at the end of the 80s, the Soviet withdrawal. Then we get the Afghan civil war, which makes the Game of Thrones look like a sort of kids' fight in a playground. And then finally, the Taliban wins control of 90% of the country by 1996. And they rename it the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan. Now, again, here we have an Islamic state. It's recognised and sponsored not by only a few powers, but the powers that support them are key. And Pakistan is the key power here, supporting the Taliban, the Islamic State of Afghanistan, and specifically within Pakistan, it's the ISI, the Pakistani Intelligence Service, and we have Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates supporting the Taliban's Islamic State as well. Now, if we go to the Middle East and Iraq, this is quite a intriguing map. Perhaps that's the best way to describe it. This was a map that was drawn in 2006. It was drawn by a retired lieutenant colonel of the US Army, a man called Ralph Peters, and he published this map in a journal, American military journal, the Armed Forces Journal, and this was basically how, this is his exact quote, how a better Middle East would look. So to give you a flavour of Ralph Peters and the type of views that he holds, one of his other kind of key statements in the first paragraph of the essay is ethnic cleansing works. Now, we have here, again, this is some quite interesting visions of Islamic states by someone who was in the US Army. If we look at Mecca and Medina, we see that is part of what Peter's called an Islamic sacred state. And again, he's using the same language as the British all those years ago. He talks about this idea of Mecca and Medina being part of constituting this sort of Islamic Vatican. There's this constant sort of equating Mecca, Medina, this space with the Vatican and Catholicism and the Pope, which I think has some significant consequences. If we look north to what is Iraq, you can see it's been divided, and Peters writes in his article, a just alignment in the region would leave Iraq's 3 Sunni majority provinces as a truncated state that might eventually choose to unify with Assyria, that is minus its littoral, the coast. And so this rather neatly predicts the caliphate of the Islamic State. And we can also see Peters, he talks about Free Kurdistan, and again, that also maps onto the territory controlled by Kurdish forces today. So now if we look at what actually happened, you can, hopefully you can sort of see how that Peters' vision maps onto the Caliphate of Islamic State. Now again, the Islamic State in Syria and Iraq is supported by key powers within the Middle East, particularly within parts of the Saudi state and the Gulf states, and also Turkey. We also have the maxim, my enemy's enemy is my friend, and we know that some people within the governments and the bureaucracies of powers such as Israel and the USA, they have said that with Islamic State, it is a great destabilizing factor in the region, which is seen as a good thing because it damages once powerful regional states such as Syria and Iraq. So if I can draw some conclusions for these various case studies that I've shown you. So I think taken together, they show the power of the notion that Islam could be utilized as a tool in the construction and composition of states to serve imperial, personal and great power and regional power interests. But they also show, especially in the British case, the very severe limitations of that notion that Islam could be manipulated in such a way. Islam was not and is not some abstract monolith that can nevertheless be shaped in ways conducive to the aims and ambitions of powers and those who work in the service of those powers. The supposed power of Islam to play a role in these Islamic states, which emerged from the imaginations of imperial officials and in the present day, was ultimately a chimera for those men. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John, for a really fascinating talk, a whistle-stop tour, I think, of lots of places that are familiar to us through the news, but lots of stories and histories that I think many of us were unfamiliar with. And I think we might like to find out more about some of these crazy individuals as well. I particularly like the McBryan. Even the name is just, everything about him was just really quite bizarre. I'm looking around to see if there are any questions. Please do put your hands up if there are. And I'm also looking at Sinead to see if there are already any questions online. Not so far. So I think one thing that I wondered while you were talking is, how much do you think current policymakers in these regions, or rather policymakers, say, in the US and here, looking at these regions, how much are they aware of any or all of this background? Does this ever come into play today?
Yes, but in, again, some quite strange ways. So in Afghanistan, and I may have the date wrong, but I think until quite recently, one of the key texts that some military officers were set was T. Lawrence's 7 Pillars of Wisdom, because that was seen as kind of a key sort of training manual which they could learn from. Now, obviously, learn from in a operational sense in terms of Lawrence's guerrilla warfare, but also it was seen as a text in understanding what the phrase that you see in some of these journals and private and public writings, this idea that there is something called like the Muslim mind or the Muslim mindset. So I think, again, there is an awareness of that history, of some of these histories that I've spoken about, but the way in which they're sort of reflected on can be quite problematic.
Yes, okay. And what about, we have got a question, but I did want to just ask a little bit more about this guy Peters. Is he just a crazy outlier, or are there people around him who also have similar views?
Well, so Peters was a very long-serving US Army officer. He served in various parts of the US Army and in various sort of theatres of war, including Afghanistan and Iraq. And I mean, he's now seen as a bit of a renegade intellectual, not least because he's broken with some of the neoconservatives that used to be dominant in policy making, and he's recently come out against Trump. So he's now seen as sort of beyond the pale by the group in which he was associated with. But he was seen as, with this article in particular, he was seen as kind of sort of this key military intellectual figure who was doing what some people called like the hard thinking that had to be done in order for the Middle East to kind of be sorted out. Again, this notion that a power like the US could sort of propose these things and then try and get them enacted on the ground. So, I mean, I wouldn't say he's kind of he's not sort of the most important figure in this sort of area, but he definitely has significant influence.
Right, thank you. Okay, we have a microphone, so please wait until that's with you before asking a question so it can be heard online. So we've got Carl first of all. Thank you.
Yeah, this is a difficult one. I just wonder how far you think that actually this might be the British mainly trying to find secular rulers, that is, people who have a royal title, who they feel can in addition have an Islamic element or control more extremist Islamic elements. So if you look at this, that on a worldwide scale, in Malaya, the Sultan is seen as controlling adat, custom and religion, which is seen as moderate, and they're supported against people seen as more extreme. If you look at the Hashemites, the British actually do form two kingdoms out of the Hashemites. They managed to get Iraq for a while, and Jordan's still going strongly, thank you very much. So the fact there's an Islamic element is useful, but I wonder if actually, almost globally, what the British want is moderate, secular-style leaders with traditional authority who can then tame and help them with Islam and Islamic populations. Thanks.
Actually, pass it forward, please, Carl. No, okay. Well, we'll answer this one.
Yeah, no, I think that is a good challenging question, and I think the thing here, it's about sort of weighing up what exactly those British imperial officials, how they sort of weigh the importance of Islam versus the secular, and whether it's kind of just an advantageous add-on, as it were, to these sort of more established temporal rulers. But I think if you look at the sort of the intellectual genealogy of how these British men, there are some women like Gertrude Bell who plays a role in Iraq, but if you look at how they sort of engage with Islam and try and sort of analyse it on their own terms, I would argue that I think they do see it as a kind of a vital force. I would sort of take the opposite view to you, but thanks for the question.
We've got one question here, thank you.
Yeah, I was interested in, this map and the other maps you showed, the sort of redrawing of boundaries and the sort of power of the maps. could you shed any light on how they're drawing this up? Are they sort of using military cartographers? And, you know, that one of Libya with all the very straight lines, you know, how are these agreed? You know, are they in fact, do they reflect reality in any way? Or is it, you know, is it just a sort of, you know, model in someone's mind?
Yeah, so I think this sort of issue of what these lines on the ground actually mean in the imperial period is absolutely crucial. And so the external borders of Italian Libya, for example, I mean, they're kind of internationally agreed, but the Italians only really kind of make those borders solid by the time we get to the period of Mussolini. So if we're looking at the Italians arrive in 1911, it's only till the very sort of eve of the Second World War when those borders actually kind of become secure. But in terms of how these translate on the ground, at least in terms of actual control, yeah, it is very much fictional. If we look at kind of Libya, this map of Libya, it notionally suggests that the Italians control all of it, whereas, as I was saying, kind of the Senussi, they are really kind of the real power on the ground, at least beyond that coastal strip which the Italians control quite tenuously. So I think the fact that the maps don't correspond to reality, I think that also feeds into these kind of geopolitical imaginaries that I've been talking about. I mean, there's this idea that, well, that doesn't translate to reality, but we might be able to make it so, but then we might be able to come up with something like this again. So it's sort of, yeah, cartography can be used in very nefarious ways.
We have a question online and then we have a question in the front. I just take the question online first because the microphone is right there.
Hi, John. This is a question from our colleague Neil Younger, who is watching at home, presumably. He says, it's very interesting to hear about your research into relatively recent events in Afghanistan and Pakistan and Syria and so on. It would be very interesting to hear more about how you or others go about researching these events, many of which are potentially rather dangerous and certainly often quite secretive, and maybe how much these events remain quite difficult to understand.
Yeah, so I think in terms of, if I talk about the more historic events, most of at least the official files are now declassified, although in the case of McBryan, there was one file I found in the National Archives which is still closed until 2043. Now, you know, that sounds intriguing and potentially who knows what might be in there. But, I mean, as we've known from other declassifications of official files, often what's in there can be quite mundane. So there may not necessarily be anything particularly explosive. And we've got the private papers of many of these officials who have now been deposited in archives. And so things like their diaries and their private letters, we're now able to look at that so you can compare what they were saying on sort of official memoranda with what they were kind of thinking more privately. So that's something significant. In terms of the more contemporary things, yes, I mean, that still remains quite challenging, although one of the interesting developments recently, at least in relation to the Middle East and Iraq, was the WikiLeaks. They released lots of US intelligence and State Department cables which were unredacted. That is, you could read everything that was in them, and that's really sort of one of those sources that you never think you're going to see until many years later, and then there'll be lots of things crossed out. But that's really given a lot of impetus to new scholarship on this topic, because we've now got sort of thousands of things that we can look for. Obviously, in terms of doing research on the ground, that remains pretty hazardous.
I don't think the OU insurance would cover you, should I? Yes, please.
Thank you for your talk. There seems to be some confusion, I think, in my mind as to what actually went on, because I think one of the things you said was that maybe certain regimes were put there which were moderate compared to extremists. Now, that doesn't that actually contradicts the fact that during the Second World War, the British were responsible for establishing the Saudi kingdom in conjunction with the Wahhabis, which was a problem in the 19th century, but the Ottoman Empire, the Sultan, commissioned the Muhammad Ali, who was then the governor of the Pasha of Egypt, to go and sort them out, and he did, and he then re-established Hashemite control over the religious places. So it's a confused signal. I think the priority was to maintain their empire, and to some extent the Indian empire, which was necessary for them, because there were a number of contradictory things which were put in there, including the national home for the Jews, for instance. So that was another concept. So I don't know what you think about that. You know.
No, thank you very much for the question. And I mean, really, in terms of, if we go back to the example of Arabia, which you rightly mentioned, you know, India is kind of really central to, you know, understanding kind of what the British are trying to do in the region. And what we have in the First World War, we've got these kind of two different sets of British officials. You've got those based in Cairo and London who are agitating for the Hashemites and Sharif Hussein, and then you've got officials in India who are, they've been, their kind of area of responsibility is also the Gulf states, which in that period, that also includes the Saudis. And I think really, you know, with the case of Saudi Arabia, I think that is an extremely significant case, not least for the Middle East and Islam at the time and today, but also the way in which the Saudi state is founded. By this I mean the modern Saudi state after the First World War. It's really, you've got these two British allies, and the British really, they're not kind of supporting either of them. I mean, they're giving some money, but they refuse to give the Saudis arms because they know what they'll be used against. They'll be used against the Hashemites. But it's this, you've got this issue of, you've got these two British allies fighting each other, and then the Saudis win by sort of a force of arms. But the British aren't kind of actively pushing this. It's a result of the contradictions of their policy in these kind of different areas of I guess, sort of British bureaucratic chaos colliding with each other. And then these local actors are very much taking the opportunity. Yes, and I absolutely take your point about the nature of these regimes, and what we see, especially after the founding of that modern Saudi regime, and when they take over Mecca and Medina, you see lots of opposition to how they rule those places from Muslim pilgrims and others, not least from India, who are quite opposed to what the Saudis are doing there. So thank you for your question.
The only other thing is,
I'll have the microphone.
what, in your opinion, was Lawrence's approach to this question, or did he not think about it?
So Lawrence's view of the region, and if you just bear with me for 1 second, there is a quote from one of his secret memos. He talks about the Arabs. And this is a memo on the politics of Mecca, but he's talking about Arabia more generally. If properly handled, the Arabs, they would remain in a state of political mosaic, a tissue of small, jealous principalities incapable of cohesion. So sort of Lawrence's, I guess, role here is that he's interested in really there being as many different states in the region as possible, because then he feels that would be advantageous to the British, because it would be easier to control lots of small states who are against each other rather than a larger state. So, yeah.
Are there any other questions in the room? Yes, thank you. Just wait for the microphone, please.
I'm particularly interested in, well, I'm interested in all of it, but I'm particularly interested in your take on the modern day problems in the region, particularly why modern day Islamic State has become so popular in some Arab states, or became popular in some Arab states, but not others.
Yeah, that's a really important question. And I think part of the answer lies, in how Islamic State is presented in the official media of some of those states, how it's presented on social media. That's certainly been quite important. Also, in terms of the sort of popularity, some of the states in the Middle East were very happy for their subjects or citizens to go and fight for Islamic State, because it means they would sort of no longer be the problem of that state. It was seen as a good way of getting rid of troublesome elements. In terms of more popular versus less popular, I mean, again, it kind of really comes down to the interpretation of Islam that Islamic State had, and obviously that was seen as more attractive to some people more than others, and again, kind of Islam being a very complex a religion. There are some parts of Islam which were absolutely opposed, but I mean, this is again sort of something which, if we go back to Carl's earlier question, it can't be boiled down to religion alone. And I think what's been clear after the collapse of the caliphate, and now we're getting more sort of stories about the fighters and kind of why they went there and what their motivations were. We've got a whole host of other factors in terms of, their kind of their lives at home, and that's kind of, from their home lives to kind of how they sort of interacted with society. So it's, again, it's the classic historian's answer. It's a combination of factors.
Thank you. Are there any other questions that anyone has? I wondered, when you were describing this idea of mobilizing religion in the late 19th and early 20th century, was that a uniquely British undertaking? What did other imperial powers do?
Well, I mean, if I can talk just in terms of Islam, it's something which all the European powers do to varying degrees, whether it's Germany in German East Africa, or the French in their territories in North and West Africa, the Italians, but also non-European states as well. So I think the Ottoman Empire is one of the key examples here. The proclamation of jihad that I talked about in 1914, we've had a lot of research on how it's received amongst the colonial subjects of the European powers, but the more recent interesting research shows how it was received amongst the Ottoman Muslim subjects, so those who are living in modern-day Turkey. And it really kind of helped mobilize those fighting in the Ottoman armies in their kind of war against the imperial powers. And I think just one kind of last thing to say to perhaps finish on a slightly non-historical note is this sort of idea that Islam could be mobilized as a religion. It did rest on these imperialist assumptions about, well, if they're Muslim, they're fanatical and they can be kind of induced to rise up because that's sort of an essential part of Muslim nature. And again, that's just one misconception about Islam and Muslims among many. But we do see that not only in the writings of these officials, but also in fiction. If you look at some of the books released around this period, end of the 19th century, early 20th century, you get sort of titles. There's one called The White Prophet, which is where there's this prophet that comes from the desert and he rouses the Muslim masses. And then you've got one of the most famous books from the First World War. John Buchan, most famous for the 39 Steps. He has a book called Greenmantle, published in 1915, which is based on that Ottoman proclamation of jihad, the idea that there's this prophet waiting to be sort of activated by the Ottomans that will help win the war by this sort of power of Islam. So this mobilization goes across lots of areas.
Thank you. So any last questions or comments? Now's your chance. Otherwise, oh no, there is one more.
I just have one. If there's not an answer, it doesn't matter. But I wonder, if we reverse this, is there any sign that actually the British are being driven by particular Muslims? So, for instance, is Idris actually more manipulating the British than the other way round? Are the Muslim League in India, given Britain's fears of what happens after the World War I as well, are they actually manipulating British policy? In other words, I'm just basically fishing for a voice from the other side.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, really what we've got here is people like Idris and others. They are, in fact, being very skillful in playing on these, British conceptions, misconceptions around Islam and Muslims, and they use it very skillfully as a lever in order to advance their own political interests. And they're able to, I think, kind of amplify certain things which they know kind of get under the British skin, as it were. They know what sort of buttons to push in terms of how to manipulate the British in certain ways. So, no, I mean, it's certainly not a kind of, a process which is driven by the British and others are passive. It's very much a two-way process.
Yes. Thank you. There's one more question.
Thank you. It was, I talked about the British and their interests in India, but and there was a reference to other colonial countries which didn't have that problem, like the French. They'd lost more or less their possessions, so that kind of thing, and the Portuguese and the Belgians. Now the Belgians, of course, I don't think they occupied much Islamic territory, but now the French, for instance, was it just pure imperialism in their case? Not that they needed something to protect their empire or anything? And similarly with the Portuguese, it was just pure, colonialism in order to get advantages in trade and enrich themselves, which is slightly different to the British approach because they had the sort of geopolitical thing to deal with.
Yeah, I think that's a really significant point because we've got the British. They're an imperial power, but as you say, they're also a global power. So they've kind of got these sort of multiple levels in which they're operating. And I think the French are an imperial and a global power as well, but obviously on a much smaller scale. So I think even though some of the issues are similar in terms of, say, the French or the British and the Portuguese, the ways in which the British kind of engage and manipulate or are manipulated by certain actors, it takes on a different dimension because I think exactly as you said, I mean, if we take the example of India, what the British are doing in India and their calculations regarding India, it's never just about India alone. It's about how kind of India fits into that broader conception of Britain as a global power, but also Britain's more sort of local engagements with other parts of the world that are adjacent to India, such as the Middle East, Southeast Asia, etc. So this is kind of how these things are connected. But yeah, it's a very, very important point.
Thank you. So if there are no more questions, then it's just for us to thank our speaker very much for an interesting talk and to thank you all for coming and for your questions. Thank you.